this video about the importance of being earnest, I want to introduce you to some of the big ideas that you should be looking out for as you read the play, and also provide a little bit of historical and social context. I think you're really going to enjoy the importance of being earnest. It's one of the most frequently quoted plays in the English language. Whether or not you are aware of it, maybe you've heard the term bun burying, maybe you've heard some of the really famous quotes or aphorisms from this play. You probably have a little bit of experience with this play already, and maybe you've even seen some of the film versions of the play. There's a really famous one with Reese Witherspoon and Colin Firth that you can check out after you've read the play, of course. There's a separate lecture about Oscar Wilde and his life and his eventual imprisonment, but I want to talk here about something that Wilde was really the master of, and that is epigrams. Epigrams are really short, pithy, to-the-point statements that are funny. They might have some sort of pun, they might be truthful or satirical, but they're really short and witty. And the play is filled with them. That's what makes it such a pleasure to read. Also, if you were to go to see the play, you would find that a lot of people in the audience might already know some of the lines because they are so famous. And you might already know some of the lines already, or some of the references, like references to bun burying. An aphorism is similar to an epigram. It's some sort of short, witty saying, but oftentimes aphorisms are a little bit more serious. They're kind of like an adage, and they reveal some sort of universal truth. So I've included a couple examples from the play. You can see some of them, like this one about food. I hate people who are not serious about meals. It is so shallow of them. Some of them have some sort of inversion, right? Or kind of a flip-flop of what we would normally think is true. You would think that it would be shallow to be obsessed with meals, right? Because meals shouldn't really matter. What you have for lunch shouldn't really matter. But if you're like me, you know that actually what you have for lunch really matters. Maybe it's all you think about. And so maybe there's a kernel of truth here, and it's sort of funny. So you would think that it would be shallow to be interested in meals, but here it's the reverse of that. And then, of course, some are a little bit more profound. Some are obviously quite funny. This one comes from a character, Aunt Augusta or Lady Bracknell, in The Importance of Being Earnest, but the play is filled with them. I think you're going to have a lot of fun identifying some of those. In a separate lecture, we talk about the aesthetic movement. I want to talk here about how it applies to the play. So aestheticism is the elevation of taste and the pursuit of beauty as chief principles in art and in life. And you can see how for figures like Wilde and other champions of the aesthetic movement, aestheticism is really a backlash to rigid Victorian morality. The Victorians were very buttoned up and very conservative, and Oscar Wilde likes to poke fun at that and then kind of go over the top in the opposite direction. So as you read, notice which characters are interested in the finer things in life: good food, good drink, good company, good music, witty conversation and banter. Which characters embody this aesthetic ideal? Certainly, I think one's going to jump out at you right away, Algernon, but there are female characters like Cecily, who are not exactly dandy figures, I'll talk about that in a second, but who embody some of these ideas, right? Art for art's sake, meaning beauty and art just for the sake of it. Cultivating your own persona, the way that you look, the way that you dress, the way that you speak, that is actually really important. That is valued above morality, because morality can end up being hypocritical or kind of subjective anyway. Wilde famously once said you should either be a work of art or wear a work of art, which kind of gets to the key of aestheticism. Devotion to sensual pleasure, art, and beauty. I think it's easy to think of aestheticism as just being obsessed with superficial things, right? Like eating well, drinking well, looking good, always having a flower in your buttonhole. But I think it goes beyond that, especially when we think about the time period and the reaction to Victorian stuffiness. As some critics have said, Oscar Wilde kind of opened up the window on Victorian society in England and let in a breath of fresh air. And we know from his personal life, again in a separate lecture, that he spent some time in prison near the end of his life. Not for aestheticism, but for his relationship with another man. The dandy is a figure that people see a lot in plays and just literature of the time. A dandy is a man who pays excessive attention to his dress or to cultivating his persona. So the dandy is often a really witty character who just relishes word play and the finer things in life. So Algernon is pretty clearly a dandy figure. A dandy figure isn't just a man who's effeminate. It's more complicated than that. So that's one thing to be aware of as you're reading. Let's talk about comedy. So these terms are almost synonymous, but not quite. This is an example of a comedy of manners. A comedy of manners was a type of comedy that was performed a lot in the Restoration era in England. So after the monarchy was restored in England. And this is an example of a Victorian era comedy of manners. And with these comedies, the playwright is making fun of polite, well-bred society. Oftentimes there's some sort of love triangle or some sort of big scandal, and there is sometimes hypocrisy, or there's almost always is some level of hypocrisy. There sometimes is a big misunderstanding that the whole plot of the play hinges on, and sometimes the characters' names in these comedy of manners plays are really important. The characters' names reveal something about them. Lampoon, you probably heard this term before. You might know of the Harvard Lampoon. It's a broad satirical piece that uses ridicule to attack a person, a group, or an institution. So lampoon is just a more specific type of satire. And lampoons tend to be ridiculing and mocking pretty directly a specific person, but they can also mock an institution. Satire is a more general term. This is a literary work in which human vice or folly is attacked through irony, derision, or wit. So you can view this play as just a comedy, right? You can enjoy the food fights. You can enjoy what it's saying about gender. You can enjoy the just beautiful and hilarious lines. But you can also look at it as a satire. Think about what Wilde is critiquing here. And you might also think about different choices that you could make if you were producing this play. Often the character of Lady Bracknell is played in drag. I've posted an example of a really famous actor playing the part, and you can see him transform with hair and makeup and just posture into Lady Bracknell. Is that just to be kind of funny and unexpected? Actually, at this point, it's not even all that unexpected. Or is that for some other reason? That's what I love about this play, is you can read it just as a comedy and just enjoy the comedic aspects, but think about what these inversions are saying underneath the surface. And of course, keep the time period of Victorian England in mind. The title of the play is The Importance of Being Earnest, and obviously there is a character, Jack, who is pretending to be someone he is not. Earnest. Earnest, spelled with an A, is the quality of being serious, purposeful, sober, grave, fervent. The dictionary definitions include characterized by or proceeding from an intense or serious state of mind, showing depth of or sincerity of feeling, serious in intention, purpose, or effort. So Jack really wants to portray himself as this earnest person, right? This earnest guardian. But we know pretty quickly that Jack is not honest, and he's not entirely earnest. He does take himself pretty seriously, but he's not entirely earnest. And he's not entirely earnest, and he's not entirely earnest without the A. But then when we get to the end of the play, there will be a nice little twist there. So obviously the name confusion and the name mix-up, and also the title of the play, this concept of being earnest, being straightforward and sincere and serious, is getting us to think about what it means to be authentic. But also it's just ripe for comedy, right? Anytime someone takes themselves very seriously or is trying to be very serious, but we know that there's some hypocrisy there, that's just going to be hilarious, right? We'll get to that when we see a really dramatic and hilarious scene involving costumes and morning dress. We'll talk about that a little bit later. An antonym for earnest is trivial, insincere, or thoughtless. And remember that the subtitle of this play is a trivial comedy for serious people, another inversion of what you would expect. Why would you have a trivial or kind of silly, funny comedy for serious people? It should be a serious comedy for serious people, right? But again, Wilde likes to flip things on their heads. Let's talk a little bit about the Victorian era. So the Victorian era, of course, encompasses the reign of Queen Victoria, one of the longest ruling monarchs from 1837 to 1901. To the Victorians, proper dress and manners were very important. There were strict codes of conduct, and of course, sexual restraint and being modest were key. Gender roles were really important. Women were expected, and by women, I'm referring to upper class women. I know that's unfair, but that's who we're talking about in this play. Women were expected to volunteer, get married, manage a home, demonstrate obedience and refinement, and wear modest clothing. There was the idea of the angel of the house. The woman's realm was in the home, whereas the man's sphere was outside of the home. Men were expected to be honorable, scandal-free, honest, and orderly. And when we think about being scandal-free and honest, we don't exactly think of Jack/Ernest, do we? More Victorian era values. I think this quote from a critic really captures the feeling of the Victorian era. The Victorian age of British history can be viewed as, quote, a period of great contradictions, as people equated outward appearance with inward morality. But social issues such as prostitution, child labor, and poverty were on the rise. So, of course, every era has hypocrisy, right? No era can totally live up to its own ideals. But to the Victorians, how you appear on the outside, appearing sentimental, appearing to be a do-gooder, appearing to be modest, was very important. And Wilde seems to be poking fun at characters who are so focused on the exterior that they forget to focus on the interior. This is captured really nicely with Gwendolyn, right? She's so focused with marrying a man whose name is Ernest, because she just loves the name so much and what the name evokes, that she loses sight of marrying a man who is actually earnest, who actually has the qualities of being earnest and honest and sincere and authentic. So she really captures that idea. Wilde, of course, mocks Victorian hypocrisy and rigidity through wordplay, paradox, and inversions. And earlier when I was talking about the dandy figure, another thing that I notice when I'm reading the play is the dandy figure is often kind of the hero, even though he might seem ridiculous or he might seem overly obsessed with good champagne or eating delicious muffins or playing piano really badly, but playing piano with lots of style. The dandy figure of Algernon and Cecily are characters that I'm rooting for the most. I like those characters the most, and the story really hinges on those characters. So I don't think we can merely write them off as dandies. And of course, Oscar Wilde himself, the celebrity that he was, given the fact that he is a champion of the aesthetic movement in his own life, or he was a champion of it in his own life, he is certainly not trying to belittle characters like Algernon, even though they're quite funny. The play is filled with dichotomies and also doubles, and as I said before, lots of inversions. So some of these are dichotomies or divisions, but others are really more doubles. The play is really symmetrical. When you read it, you'll notice, okay, there is the butler Lane in town, there's the butler Merriman in the city. There are the two upper class characters of Algernon and Jack or Ernest. There are the two love interests, Cecily and Gwendolyn. There are two kind of more middle class figures who fall in love, Miss Prism and Dr. Chasuble. So the play is quite symmetrical. Also, part of it takes place in the country, part of it takes place in the city. Men versus women. And again, we can think of this idea of inversions and expected orders. You would think that the men in this time period would be more in charge, and yet Gwendolyn and Cecily take charge of their own proposals. Cecily writes about Ernest, and what she writes in her diary ends up kind of becoming true. And the same thing with Algernon. So they kind of create their own reality. Lady Bracknell is hilarious and overbearing, and as ridiculous as she is, she really takes on the role of the father figure. She is the one arranging the marriage. She's the one deciding whether or not Jack is good enough for her daughter Gwendolyn. And she even says that her husband's role is in the home. So we see these flips in expected gender roles. Is that just to be funny? I don't think so. I think there's more going on. Sincerity versus insincerity, honesty versus inventiveness. I know the opposite of honesty is more lying, but in this case, the characters lie, but think about the ending and what, I don't want to reveal too much, but what happens in the ending, the idea of creating your own reality, creating your own persona, creating your own self, and the characters are lucky enough that some of their lies kind of become true in interesting ways. Natural passions versus societal constraints. Marriage versus death. Again, those don't seem like they would be opposites, but there are all sorts of jokes about marriage being a kind of death. Lady Bracknell says something really funny. I don't have the exact quote, but about Lady Harbury looking 10 or 20 years younger after her husband dies. You would think it would be the opposite. Grief is supposed to age you, but here it makes her look much younger. So marriage and death are both referenced here. They're not exactly opposites. In fact, in the play, they're almost synonyms. Character doubles, so characters who seem very similar, like Merriman and Lane. Fact versus fiction, especially in terms of writing. Think about Cecily's writing, but also, of course, think of Miss Prism's writing. Her writing is really key to the play. She teaches Cecily these kind of rigid, strict German lessons, but it's her manuscript that causes the whole misunderstanding to begin with. The aristocracy versus lower orders, seriousness versus triviality, and unexpected puns. The play is loaded with them. One example is when Lady Bracknell is talking about how Jack has no family line because he was found in a handbag of a train station. And that idea of line as in lineage, but also line as in the train. And while we're talking about puns, I should mention that the names, aside from just Earnest, are really important, especially Miss Prism. Think about what a prism is. It's some sort of glass object that refracts light. Also, a prism can be some sort of metaphorical framework or way to view something or distort something or understand something, which makes sense given Miss Prism's role in this play and causing this whole misunderstanding in the first place. And then also Miss Prism sounds a whole lot like a word that I didn't know until I read this play, misprision, which means a wrongful performance of one's duty or one's job, or some sort of confusing incident. So Miss Prism seems to capture that idea because not only is she a pretty bad governess, I think the first rule of being a governess is don't lose the baby, and she loses the baby. And also she is the one at the end of the play who is able to kind of insert the key and make everything make sense once again. So she causes the whole mix-up when Ernest/Jack is the baby, but she also shows the light at the end of the play. And I think that can be no coincidence that her name is Prism, and Miss Prism sounds so much like Miss